Good morning, colleagues. Okay, thanks for coming. Thank you for availing yourself even today. Today we'll be looking at another interesting topic, which I always entitled it Understanding of Quantitative and Qualitative Data Collections. In other words, we want to understand these two types of methods on how do you collect data in both quantitative and qualitative studies or methods. So we'll be looking at that specifically today. As I always put it, those who are new, my name is Welcome Kubega. I am an Accolade facilitator assigned to Ekurhuleni Learning Center. Well, the outcome of today, I'm hoping that by the end of this session, we should be able to have a clear distinction between quantitative and qualitative methods. All right, we'll expand on that a little bit. And also understand the aspect of the mixed methods, okay? And in addition to that, we are also going to get a better understanding on the different types of mixed method designs. So we'll be looking at those. And the other interesting aspect, we'll be able to understand the difference between quantitative and quantitative data collection methods. What is the difference between the two? We'll look at some theory and concept around that. And also how to design, especially quantitative data collection instrument, and also maybe a little bit of qualitative, those who are doing qualitative. So we'll look at some of those aspects. Maybe before we go further, we just want to give those who were not in the previous session, especially the one which we held, it was last week, if I'm not mistaken, or a week before last week, because of a lot of holidays in between. But in our last previous session, where we are trying to look at the aspect of how to understand the research methodology. So let's recap on the few points which we touched on. I think the recording is available. Those of you who were able to view the recording and you are not present in the lecture session or the class session, you can also go and listen to the recordings. I'm not going to touch on all of the aspects. I'll look at few points there. I think what we did in the previous session, we tried to understand the concept of the research design and also the concept of the research methodology. And based on our understanding, we came to a conclusion that a research design is more of an outline on how the investigation will be conducted. Basically, it's a framework or a plan. Whereas the research methodology is defined, it's where we define the research method which you'll be using. And I also went further and tried to get a clear distinction between a method and methodology. And one colleague there, I think Nomhle, she also gave an analogy based on that. But basically, when you look at the method, it's more of a technique or a process. But when you look at methodology, definitely it's a body of knowledge. And we went further and said you need to understand this concept in detail. A method, a research design, and an approach. All right. Sometimes also bring an aspect of a research paradigm. But we said we have three types of research approach. And when you look at those three types of research approach, we have what you call an inductive approach. And that inductive approach, it always aligns to qualitative, okay? And also we have what you call a deductive approach, which is aligned to quantitative methods. So let's look at the deductive approach. We say basically it is from general to specific. It's where sometimes you test an hypothesis, okay? And further, when you look at this deductive approach, it is aligned to a paradigm which you call it positivism. But when you look at inductive, it is aligned to a paradigm which you call it interpretivism, or it's aligned to a paradigm which you call, it is interpretism. Basically, it's more about qualitative. And in that case, you may find that maybe we are trying to build a theory. The theory is not existent, especially in inductive approach. But when you come to deductive approach, the theory is already there, okay? Then we have another one which you call it abductive, which is more an interaction between the inductive and also the deductive approach. Those are the approach we have shared last week. And we also spoke about population, the sample, and the sample techniques. We were able to differentiate the two types of sampling techniques, the broader one, which is probability, and we have looked at an example of that, a technique of stratified, and also we look at non-probability when you look at a sampling technique called convenience and snowboarding. Please, like the other colleague asked last week, to say, is there any different, to say for different methods, is there any different sample techniques? Then I said yes. So you look in another session where we'll be talking in detail about sampling techniques, okay, to see which one are aligned to qualitative, which one are aligned to quantitative. We also look at data collection, secondary sources, and also primary sources. And we touch a little bit on data analysis and also piloting. I think today the main focus definitely will be looking at the data collection methods, all right? So that when you go in our next two sessions, if I'm not mistaken, we'll be looking on how to analyze each one of those data collection methods so that we work in one of them in detail. So let's quickly look at the next slide. I'm not going to indicate this one. Sometimes I make it a standing slide. Basically, I just want to show to you today that we are looking at data collection methods. Okay, so that's what we are looking at. We'll touch also on how to develop the instruments for the different data collection methods. How to develop an instrument for quantitative and also for qualitative. Let's quickly look at the difference between quantitative and qualitative methods. I always say, you need to look at the first four letters there. The quan and also the qual. And if you have that clear, then you know that the quan, there should be numbers involved. In the qual, there are no numbers involved. Please, colleagues, even though I say in qualitative methods, there are no numbers involved, I'm not saying that you are not supposed to tell us about your sample and also the population. You still have to do that. But when you analyze your data, you are not going to present it in the form of numbers. I've seen most of the students what they normally do when they do online data collection, especially in qualitative. They want also to indicate the numbers. All right, the numbers, definitely will want the numbers to say how many you have interviewed, what was the population, but the actual interpretation and analysis of the data is not going to give us the numbers. Choices is simply about deciding how many data types you will use in your research. Always when you design your research, you have your title, you have your aim, your objectives, then you decide what methodology or what methods are you going to use. You don't use a method because you like that method or you think that method is easy. You use a method because you understand that the method you'll be using is going to assist you to analyze your questions or your hypothesis. There are three options. The first one, we call it the mono method. It means that you will only make use of one data type. In other words, you choose in the mono method to say, I'm using only quantitative. I'm using only qualitative. So you have to use one. You can't use both of them. So if you choose quantitative, it means you're going to stick with quantitative from the beginning up to the end. Your paradigm should also align to quantitative. Your approach should also align to quantitative. Your data collection instrument also should align to quantitative. The same with qualitative. Then you have what you call the mixed methods, where you use both quantitative and qualitative data. And that's why we refer to that as a mixed method. You are going to see when I define the different research designs in detail, okay? What we are used to currently, we call it a mixed method, where we collect both quantitative and qualitative data simultaneously. Okay, by simultaneously, colleagues, I'm not saying that you use the same instruments, no, but in your study, you have both quantitative and qualitative instruments. We have also what you call the multi-method. It makes use of a wider range of approaches with more than just one quantitative and one qualitative approach. The right choice depends on some of these aspects. I've mentioned those aspects, the nature of your research. If, for example, in your research, your title, you say, understanding the perception of teachers in regards to the use of technology. Definitely, there's no way you can use a quantitative method in that type of a title. You have to use a qualitative because you want to get the perception, okay? And also your research aims and objectives also assist you to decide on the type of method which you intend to use. The practical viability. Sometimes you look at cost, okay? In respect to what kind of data will you using, and also the accessibility. Sometimes you feel that in my study, I rather use quantitative because maybe it could be less costly. Maybe it could be an issue of saying it's going to be easy for me to collect data online instead of doing face-to-face. Or maybe I'll use interviews because it's going to be easy and viable for me to collect data, not individually, but I can have what you call a group interviews, so that I can have maybe 3 people in a group of 5, so that I interview them once. So you have to think about all of this aspect. But remember that we always say to our students, when you do your research, especially, even though you have been funded, make sure that the costs are not so huge. Because students, sometimes we like to think that with our research, we want to solve all the problems. Definitely, your research must be able to assist us to solve certain problems, but not all of them. Because other students, they believe that if they've done their studies, especially collected data, let's say for their master's argument's sake, in one school, that's not enough. Then they want to collect data in 20 schools. But remember that all these writings, it also depends on your level of study, okay? If you look at quantitative method, it refers to the systematic empirical investigation of social phenomena where mostly stats is involved, okay? But we are not saying that if you are not good at stats, you can't do quantitative data collection, Okay, you can still do that, because remember that there are programs which you can use, and those programs, they can analyze the data for you. And if you are in certain institution, then also there are people who have been hired to analyze that data for you and also interpret it for you. And also the supervisor is there to give guidance. So what I always say to my students, if I'm not good in mathematics, if I'm not good in computational techniques and so on, or stats, I can still do quantitative data collection. Okay, I can still go, instead of using the descriptive ones, like your frequencies and percentage, I can also do the inferential statistics, where I do some tests around my data, and also give any analysis and interpretation on that. Quantitative data is any data that is numerical form. I've spoken about that. Quant, definitely you expect numbers, such as statistics and percentages. We'll talk about that. And those are the basic statistical analysis, and you call it descriptive. Okay? In other words, you don't do any test. You just give us the frequencies, which sometimes we refer to it as numbers, and also the percentage. And remember that I always say to my students, numbers are good. We know that people, they believe in numbers. If I do whatever study or research, then I give numbers. Then I say, for example, based on our South African grade 4 learners, these are the results, or these are the numbers in regards to the reading abilities or competencies of our learners across all the schools in South Africa. Then people are going to believe that, because we give them numbers. But if I come with perception, then I said, I've interviewed 1,000 learners or grade 4 learners in South Africa, and these are their perceptions or views. People are not going to believe you, because they'll tell you that we have so many numbers of grade 4 learners in South Africa. You can't interview 1,000. We spoke about this aspect last week, I think so. Then we brought a concept which we call it a point of saturation. I think I've tried to explain it last week. But basically, numbers are good, but numbers, they don't speak on their own. You need to give them a little bit of interpretation. What do they mean? Okay, if we say 20,000 of our learners at grade 4, that's an example, colleagues, please. Their reading competency is very low. It's not enough. So you need to give the meaning. Why do you think their reading competencies are so low? What informed that? So that people will be able to understand, to say it's not just giving only numbers, but you give the meaning to the numbers. Then talk about your analysis and also your interpretation. The analysis is there, the numbers are there, but the interpretation needs to come from you as a researcher. The system or the program, whatever program you're using for quantitative, whether it could be an SPSS, whether you're using Janovi or whatever, it's not going to give you the interpretation, whether you like it or not. You are the one supposed to give that interpretation as a researcher. It's going to give you the analysis, maybe in the form of descriptive analysis. If you wanted to give you inferential statistics also, it can give you that. You can run some tests, but the interpretation comes from you. In simple terms, it means that the researcher in quantitative asks a specific narrow question and then collect a sample of numerical data. But when you look at qualitative methods, it's clear that when you look at Strauss, and Corbin, they state that by the term qualitative research, we mean any type of research that produces findings not arrived at by statistical procedures or other means of qualification. In other words, what they mean is that in qualitative, there are no stats, there are no numbers, but only the person's lives or lived experiences, behaviors, emotions, and feelings are the one which we are able to get through qualitative methods. If you want to find about how people are conducting themselves, I'll give you an example now. If you want to get the numbers, for example, if you are doing a study on understanding or on waste management, then you say, okay, I want to get an understanding about all those people who are collecting our waste, especially in our busy streets, where sometimes they even risk their lives. Then you want to find how many are they. You'll be able to get that number. But if you want to get a better understanding or perception of their views, to say, how do they feel? What makes them to be where they are? What impact does this process has in their lives? Then qualitative method will be the best, where you conduct an interview with them. Because remember that qualitative methods, especially when you apply instruments like interviews, it gives you a better way of getting a deeper understanding of the phenomena. If you are not happy about their response in a certain question, you are there with them. You can probe them. In other words, probing is possible. You can ask the question further, because remember that as a researcher, when you do qualitative studies, already you are anticipating certain responses from your participant. And if you're not getting it, what you normally do, you ask the participant further. Maybe you refrain or you ask the question in a different way. You have that latitude in qualitative. But if you do quantitative, you don't have that latitude. That's why in quantitative, one aspect which I'm going to share with you today, we call it self-reporting. I'm going to share that with you today, because quantitative is good. I like it. In fact, I like both methods, by the way. But sometimes quantitative, it does restrict you, Because what you normally do, you give your participant a questionnaire. It could be an online questionnaire. Then ask them to choose, all right? Based on the Likert scale, for example. If you say you have a two-way Likert scale, yes or no. So you give your participant an option to say yes. And remember that participant also, they may give you a wrong response in quantitative. And you are sitting with all those responses because it's a Likert scale. When we also say in quantitative, you can also have an open question. But how many open questions can you have? And I've seen that most of the time. When you put an open question in a questionnaire, students, when they analyze it and interpret it, they don't even come with coding, they don't even do themes and so on. It's just a presentation to say, in this open question, these are the people who have answered it. You give the numbers and also the response around the open question. That's it. But if you go to qualitative, definitely you'll be able to get richer data from a participant. I'm not saying that in quantitative you don't get richer data. No. But what I'm trying to say, for you to be able to get the richer and better data in quantitative, you need to run some tests. In other words, you don't only have to rely on descriptive statistic only. You need also to do what you call inferential statistic, where you run some tests using different programs. Okay, you want to look at the last point? It says this means that qualitative research is not statistical. We've spoken about that. Okay, there is no numbers involved there. I'm putting these advantages and disadvantages of both methods, quantitative and qualitative. But in your writing up, colleagues, please bear in mind, at honors level, definitely, this content is more important. When you say at honors in your research proposal, I'm going to use quantitative method. You need to describe what quantitative method is all about or is, and also the advantages and disadvantages of this method. When you go to your masters, yes, we also ask you at least to describe the method and also give us the advantages. Well, I don't know. I've seen some students in their master's dissertation, they also present disadvantages. But in my case, honestly, if I choose a certain method, why should I say about its disadvantage? Well, other supervisors, they want you also at masters to give the advantages and disadvantages of those methods. Then other supervisors, definitely at your masters, they will ask you, why have you chosen this method? Then you have to justify. But basically, in masters, we want to see your understanding of the concepts. Can you do maybe what you call research as a student? Can you research and understand the concept? But when you come to PhD, sometimes I don't even want my students to tell me about the advantage of the method they've used. I don't even want to see the disadvantage. I want them to describe to me the method they've used. That one I want it. And also give me some sites, some authors around that. That's good. But what's important at PhD definitely is why. Why these specific methods? If you have the other methods, why have you chose these methods? And also you align it to your research title. In other words, your writing is a bit advanced there. But definitely, we still need to know what are the advantages of each of these methods. I'll pick some few points there. When you look at the advantages, the first one says it's concerned with facts and variable information. It has to do more with numerical data. It can be done anonymously. There's no need for participants to be named. Definitely. When, for example, you collect data using quantitative, you don't need the participants' names, okay? But for admin purpose, you can number your questionnaire, okay? If, for example, I'm just making this example, I'm collecting data from a certain school and I'm targeting all the grade 7s, all of them. Then let's say the grade 7s are 50. Then it means I'll give the questionnaire to all of them. They are 50. All right. So what I'll do, maybe at the top of my questionnaire, I'll give numbers from 1 to 50. 1, 2, 3 until 50. And the purpose of doing that is that when you do your analysis, you are able to say, based on this number, how many of them responded like this and that in a certain statement. And also, it gives you another opportunity to say, based on this number, how many of the questionnaires which the participant or the learners have completed are usable? How many are spoiled? So that the number will be able to tally, okay? The same thing with qualitative. We also make sure that you don't use our participant or respondents' names. All right. Sometimes we use, maybe you can refer to them as participant 1 or respondent 1 or respondent 2 and so on. So you don't have to use their real names. Okay. That's what we want you guys to do in regards to your data collection. And it also goes further. If you are going to collect this data and you are going to collect it from a certain institution, let's say, for example, it's a school. When you apply for ethics, definitely you have to apply for ethics so that you collect data from the school. You contact maybe the Gauteng Department of Education. Maybe it's they give you a form, you complete it, and that form, I know if they have not changed it now, because the last time I worked on that form, it was in 2015. It used to ask you the specific school or schools from which you are going to collect data from. And they ask the names of those schools. So in that form, you indicate the names of those schools. And sometimes they even go further and ask you to provide the instrument. If it's a questionnaire, they ask you to provide the questionnaire. If it's an interview schedule, they ask you to provide that. But when you write your reports now, you don't mention the name of the schools. Even though you know the name of the schools, because when you give you the ethical permission, the Gauteng Department of Education, they are going to give you that copy also. And also the ethical number. And you know about the name of the school or of the schools. But in your report writing, when you write your report, you don't include the name of those schools. You can refer to them as school A, school B, or C, and so on. Because we want our participant to be anonymous. Because other schools definitely, they don't want to be known. They don't want their names to be associated with any research. That's why we had what are the term I always use now currently. The way people are tired about people wanting to collect data from them. When you go in any of the these retail stores, you know, we buy clothes and so on. Before you can even go out, they want you to respond to a survey. That's why we have what you call a survey fatigue. Even when we want to collect, especially like us who are more working with schools, schools are tired of completing surveys. They are tired. You'll be lucky if the school will allow you to come and collect data from them. Most educators, they are tired, honestly. Because the reason why most of them are so tired nowadays, we don't go back to them. And it's not even our fault as researchers, because even the department, honestly, it's fine. They will tell you that they can't give you 5 or 10 minutes to share your research with them. They will ask you to provide the completed thesis or dissertation, definitely, so it can be put at the library there. Because they will say, if the research or the call of research, it doesn't come from them, they are not going to give you any time to give your findings. But if it's a recall or a call from them about a certain research, definitely they'll allow you time to present your findings. So that's why we try by all means that when you collect data, we make sure that we do it once and we do it in the correct way. Like I've indicated in the past, piloting is very important. But the other advantage is that it is variable and can be used to duplicate results. While it's faster, the disadvantage is that limited to numbers and figures, it get us cold hard figures. Hence, as a method, it is unable to deal with questions that require specific feedback. It also has what you call lack of human element. In other words, you get numbers, but you cannot interrogate those numbers. If someone says, if, for example, give them a 3 Likert scale, agree, not sure, and disagree. That's what you're going to get. You will never go back and ask your participant, why have you agreed with this statement? You can't do that in quantitative. But in qualitative, you can do that. You can frame your questionnaire in such a way that it also covers some of the aspects which you wanted to ask in the form of statements. But remember that in qualitative, it's not, when you set up your instrument, it's not a test. So you can't say, I'm going to ask 50 questions from my participant. What are you going to do with all of those responses? Because it's not about numbers, it's about perception. Okay, I want us to look at the second last bullet. It says, results are open to subjective interpretation. This could happen due to researchers' bias or simple accident. Hence, research data could be manipulated so that they give you a subjective results. Colleagues, please, we don't want you to manipulate data. And you must be careful. You must be careful. And I don't even expect it from my students to do that. You must be honest with your research. Be honest. And I will say to my student, be honest. You may do it now, but I'm telling you, in 20 years' time or 30 years' time, that will catch up with you and you'll regret. And by the time, you may find that you are doing so well in all aspects of life. And someone says, definitely, this person, they didn't come to our school to collect data. Please, I want you always to be honest. If you are saying that you're going to collect data using a questionnaire from 3 schools or 2 schools, make sure that you do that. And don't manipulate the data. I want to give you examples. I know people who are already on the stage of getting better positions within the academia, and they're not able to get that because of one simple thing. I remember one of them, I can't mention names. He did his master's outside the country, and when he came to the country, they regarded that master's as a PhD. Until when a person was about to ascend a certain position, it was discovered that that institution, it was not offering any PhD. And the institution also said, definitely, the qualification was at the master's level. And all along, a person was being regarded as a professor, and he could not get that position. So please, guys, we need to be careful about these things, okay? Don't say people are not seeing you, then you manipulate that. Don't do that. The advantages of qualitative: it produces the thick, detailed description of the participants' feelings, opinions, and experiences. Okay? You are able also to achieve deeper insights about the issue. We've spoken about the issue, the aspect of probing. You can probe the participant, but you can't probe the participant until the cows come home. You know, you have to have a stop, definitely. If, for example, a certain question you're not getting what you want, you probe for the first time, the second time, and still you're getting the same answer. What you need to do, you move to the next question. Hopefully, with the other participant, you'll be able to get what you want from that question. Well, it has some advantage. The last one, it says it is flexible. It has a flexible structure. I think this probing comes in there. Okay, unlike the quantitative, it's not flexible. The disadvantages, it says, according to Silverman, states that qualitative methods sometimes leave out contextual sensitives and focus more on meaning and experience. Okay? Policymakers may give low credibility to results from qualitative approach. I've just mentioned that. People, they believe in numbers, is it? And sometimes when you look at people who are policymakers, most of the time, when they want to get research, they always rely on survey. Everything is about the survey nowadays. It also has a smaller sample size compared to the quantitative. And remember that I've said when we are looking at sample and sampling techniques, we are going to touch on the actual recommended sample size as per method. The analysis of the cases takes a considerable amount of time. So those are some of the disadvantages. I think, Lini, you have raised your hand.
Okay, I wanted to ask that, for example, if I use qualitative, right, and then I conduct interviews like on 100 educators, and then from there on, when I analyze the data that I collected, can I use it, convert it to statistics and say, like, for example, out of the 100 educators that I have interviewed, 50 indicated 1, 2, 3 or feel this way, and then maybe 10% they feel this way, and then 20%. Can I do that? And what is that called if I actually do that, instead of just coming up with an overall of this is how the educators feel or whatever. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that question. I will say honestly, regarding qualitative, when you do your analysis, no numbers, please. You don't want to see any numbers. The only time I want to see numbers in your qualitative method, it's when you tell me to say, I've interviewed 100 teachers. That's it.
Okay.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Okay.
But the analysis, no numbers. We want to see perceptions. We start by coding. Remember that when we interview them, you were asking them questions, is it? Let's say there are 5 questions. Then you get their responses to each question. Then you do your transcription. After you've done your transcription, then you do your coding. You can even ask maybe atlas.tisi to do your coding for you. Then from there, you come with the themes. Then from there, give us the verbatim response. That's what we want. Let's move now. Thanks for that question. I think that was only one question. Let's move to the next slide quickly. Well, I think some of the aspects are more repetitive here. The difference between quantitative and qualitative methods. We know that quantitative are more on numbers. Qualitative, we express them in words. Quantitative methods, it's where subjectives come in. Look at the concept subjective in quantitative, whereas in qualitatives it's objective. What's the difference between the two? I'll give you this example. I think some of you will relate to that. When you were still at school, those who maybe were at school last year or 20 years ago, it's fine, you're still at school. When you write the test, okay, they'll give you, for example, question 1. Then they say that they expect you to give 5 answers in question 1, and they give you 5 marks. When the teacher was assessing that, the teacher will have a memorandum, is it? If the first answer is correct, they give you 1 mark. The second one, and the third one, and the fourth, and the fifth. At the end, if all the answers for question 1 were correct and the marks was graded at 5 marks, you get 5 marks. That is subjective. Okay? Then the teacher will also do another aspect. Then they'll say, based on this aspect, discuss your opinion about this and that. If I'm sitting with 60 learners in my class, there's a possibility of me getting 60 different opinions. In other words, their answer scripts are not going to be the same because the question asks them to give their opinions. Then I will be able to get almost 60 opinions. Then my marking is going to be more objective. In other words, when I assess or mark as a teacher, it will depend if I agree on what the learner is giving me there. Then it's more objective. The same thing with these methods, especially qualitative. It's objective because it talks about the views. It talks about the opinions. It talks about the perceptions. If I'm going to interview hundreds learners or teachers, definitely if I have 5 questions, there's a possibility of me in each question to get a different response. Then it means that our responses are going to be objectives. So how do I come to a conclusion? How do I analyze that? I'll end up having what I call coding. Then after I've done my coding, then I'll come with themes. Then from there, I'll give an interpretation where I present it verbatim. Let's say theme 1 is called cold. Then in order to give an interpretation to this theme, definitely I'll cite maybe participant 7 to say participant said this aspect in regarding to this theme of cold. Then maybe another participant 20 said this and that and that. In other words, they have verbatim presentation. They are trying, or I'm trying to give how does it align to the theme which was formulated. So it's quite interesting to work on qualitative. It takes time, but at the end of the day, you get a deeper understanding of the issue. The other difference is that when you look at quantitative, it tests and confirms theories and assumptions. But when you look at qualitative, we use to understand concept, thoughts, and experiences. Qualitative also, it has to do with in-depth insights. While there are common quantitative methods like observation, experiment, surveys, and so on. In qualitative, you can use some of this aspect. Observation also, it falls also under qualitative. Literature, review, interviews can also be used, whether it could be individual interviews or group interviews, okay? Another interesting aspect in regards to quantitative is a concept of self-reporting. What does self-reporting mean? By self-reporting, it means you as a researcher, you'll get the answer which you want. I'm not sure it makes sense. If I'm using a Likert scale, and my Likert scale is a 3 Likert scale, okay? Let's say I've got agree. Sometimes you use neutral or not sure, then disagree. In other words, in my questionnaire, the participant in each statement, they must say if they agree or disagree or they are neutral. They must choose one. Okay? You know what's happening with our participant? Always they choose the middle one. which is neutral or not sure sometimes. So what happens is that now it's more, they're giving you what you want. Because remember that people, they just read the statement. And some of the participants may find that, especially when you're dealing with learners, they don't even read some of these statements. If you explain to them to say to each of these 50 statements, you must either choose agree, neutral, or disagree. Then maybe you explain what does agree means, disagree, and neutral. I'm telling you, out of the 50 statements, you may find that one participant or some of the participants, they've chosen the middle one, which is neutral. In other words, it's self-reporting. So how do you analyze that? Do you align the middle option in delicate scale towards your left, which is agree in this case, or towards your right, which is disagree? So you must be able to align. I always do it in a simple way. I always align it to the right. In other words, I will say, if a student chooses the concept or the middle one, which is neutral, I just combine the neutral with the disagree, and all of them are just called disagree. It works better in that way. Well, others, they will say, I prefer to align it to the left, which is agree. So you must be consistent around it. So one colleague of mine once said, why don't we give them one, or let's give them two Likert scale options, agree and disagree? Well, I don't know. Maybe it's another debate for another day. Okay, so I want us to touch on the mixed method. We've spoken about quantitative and qualitative methods. Let's look at mixed method now. I think I'm going to spend almost most of the time there a little bit. I don't know why, but I want us to understand it better now. Okay, let's look at the mixed method. It says mixed method as a method, it focuses on collecting, analyzing, and mixing both quantitative and qualitative data in a single study. It's supposed to be a single there, I'll correct it. In combination, provides a better understanding of research problems that either approach alone. Okay, so mixed method, it means that you are using two methods in one study. That's a mixed method. Simply, it is a combination of both quantitative and qualitative methods. But remember that there's a discourse or a discussion which is going on insofar as mixed method is concerned. Well, I've tried to look at some of the developments. And when I also look at the mixed method design, you'll see some of these developments coming in there. Okay, I think the next 2 or 3 slides. But the earlier stages, it has to do more of in regards to epistemology and philosophy of science. The debate was more about if the combination of quant and qualitative paradigm are possible. That was an early debate by then. But the later stage, the debate was around the question of research design. It's where we are now, and going to this current stage. It's more about the research design, the mixed method research design. Look at the other one. The debate moved on, and the discussion was focused on practical implication of the method combination, such as sampling and data analysis techniques. But currently, the issue of quality criteria for method integration. Now we're talking about more, when you look at mixed method, it's about integration. Integrating this methodology, both quantitative and qualitative. How are they being integrated? I think, guys, if you have time, just have a look at the writing by Johnson. And I think it's Ongwe Buzi. Okay, I can't pronounce the surname, but they've written more about the current mixed methods where it focuses more on integration. And when you look at the next slides now, the types of the mixed method designs, we have 4 of them. There are 4. And I like it the way Creswell and Clark are articulating it. What I think also the other scholars, they do articulate it. The first one, we call it exploratory mixed method. Then we have another one which call it explanatory mixed method. Then we have what you call triangulation mixed method. I think we are familiar with this one. That's the one we are using, and we are familiar with this. All right? We call it triangulation now. Then the last one, it's an embedded mixed method design. So we'll go through each one briefly. And I think my colleagues who are doing their PhDs in our midst, and those who are doing also their masters, they should be familiar with some of these concepts. Hopefully, even the honors, you'll be working on some of this concept at a brief undertaking. But let's look at the exploratory mixed methods. Basically, it's where the researcher first needs to explore a phenomena. Let's say you use qualitative data. You explore it in detail before attempting to measure or test it quantitatively. In other words, what you do, you collect qualitative data. Then you analyze that qualitative data with the intention on building to quantitative data analysis and interpretation. So what you normally do, I have my qualitative data collection instrument, which is my interview. I collect data, then I analyze it. Based on what comes from my analysis, all right? Then I'll decide if I need to do a quantitative data collection. In other words, I'll decide if I need to develop a quantitative data collection instrument, which is a questionnaire, in the same study. But if, for example, I say I'm fine with my qualitative data analysis the way it is, then it means if I don't need to formulate a quantitative data collection instrument, I don't formulate it. But remember that what's important about this is that you start from one methodology, you collect data in that methodology using that instrument, and you analyze it. And your findings are the ones which you are going to use to build on to use another method or to collect data in another method based on your findings. But let's look at what's happening there. I was just trying to go through this diagram here. It's always a two-phase design. So the results of the first phase, which is your quantitative data collection analysis or results, help us or help you as a researcher or inform you about the second phase. In other words, when you develop the second phase, which is qualitative phase, when you design your instrument now, you use the results of your first phase. with your quantitative results. In other words, from that questionnaire which you have developed and you analyze, you build your interview schedule based on that. Then you do your interpretation now. While this is also an exploratory mixed methods design, it is more useful when the researcher needs to develop and test an instrument. In other words, when you want to test an instrument, all right? Or when the variables are unknown, we'll talk about the variables, all right? Or when there is no guiding theoretical framework. And it tells you to say basically exploratory mixed methods. You use it if there is no theory. But when you look at this mixed method design, the exploratory one, priority is unequal and is more given to the quantitative data. In exploratory mixed methods design, only one set of data is collected at a time. Please, it's very important. You collect one set of data at a time. In other words, you collect first. If you start with qualitative data, you collect the data, you analyze it. Then from there, you build your qualitative data collection. Then you analyze it. Then from there, you do your interpretation. Explanatory mixed method design is an opposite of the exploratory mixed method design. Okay, it's just an opposite of that. Please, it almost have the same features, but remember here, where do you start? You start first by doing your quantitative data collection and analyze it. Then the follow-up, definitely, you do your qualitative data analysis and you do your interpretation. In other words, based on your quantitative data analysis, you develop your qualitative data instruments. So it's just an opposite of that. Triangulation, that's the one which I've said we are familiar with, whereby I'll say as a student, I'm using a mixed method. The correct phrase is supposed to be triangulation mixed method, okay? Whereby you collect both quantitative and qualitative data simultaneously, okay? But it doesn't mean that you collect them in one instrument, okay? It's in one research. Then design both quantitative and also your qualitative instrument, your questionnaire and your interview. The last one, which is also interesting, they call it embedded mixed method design, which most of the time we don't, our students, they normally don't use this one. Most of the time, our students, they use the first three, which are exploratory and explanatory data mixed methods, all right? And we normally don't use this one. But basically, it's the integration of both qualitative data into a primary qualitative or qualitative research design. What's important about this type of mixed method design is that one type of data is considered, all right? If you consider quantitative, definitely it becomes your primary focus. While the other one, which could be maybe qualitative, it gives support. All right? It provides a support role to your primary focus data collection type, which is quantitative. Quantitative data can be collected at the same time as the primary data. Then you refer to it as concurrent. Or after the primary data collection and analysis, then it becomes more sequential. Definitely the word after, it refers to sequential. An example, I think this example is easy. A quantitative survey be complemented with a qualitative interview to understand the why behind a certain survey response. For example, I've collected data quantitatively, okay? which is my primary focus. And I've used a questionnaire. And in that case, I want to find why these participants have responded to this statement by choosing disagree. So in order for me to answer the why, then what I need to do now, I develop a qualitative instrument. Then I go and question the participant. That's why I'm saying most of the time we don't do that. All right? Maybe because of it's costly and time. But I've also provided the source for this diagram if in my presentation, please, guys. All right. So I think those who are already on a certain level of writing, they'll be able to use some of the content which I've just shared with the mixed method. But my honor student, I think the focus definitely is going to be on this type of design, the triangulation one. Okay. I just want to go to the next one. All right, before I move to the next slide, I see that there's some things which are happening on the chart. Let's quickly go there for 2 minutes. Thank you. If you have 2 research questions aligning with qualitative data and 1 research, okay, I think that will be a mixed method. Let's leave it like that. Okay, but it's a bit confusing, your question. Recently, I have completed a couple of questionnaires where I choose between agreeing and disagreeing. Then I ask why I choose that option. What kind of method does that fall? I think definitely if you look, when you have a questionnaire, it's more about quantitative. So it's a Likert scale, all right? We look at that when you talk about designing a quantitative data collection instrument. Sometimes we give a 2 Likert scale, sometimes 3 Likert scale, others will give 4, others 5, others 6. So you have to choose one option around that. Okay? Because remember that we want to get your understanding, whether you agree with a certain statement or you don't agree with it. That's all what we want from you. Then from there, we analyze it and give a descriptive analysis. And you can even go further and do inferential statistic analysis around it. So choosing is not a bad thing, Christy. Okay. Tabitha, quickly, please. I want to move to the next slide.
Okay, thank you so much, Doc. I just want to find out, based on KK's previous question, I think it was KK that asked the question previously to say, if you collect data using the qual data collection method, and then you analyze it using the quantitative data collection method, is it allowed? Is her question not linked to the explanatory mixed method design?
No,
is
please.
It okay? Right, do you understand though?
No, I understand what you're saying.
Okay,
can I request?
All right.
Can I request to say, let's look at some of the simple way of doing this research. Okay?
Okay.
Because remember that if we are going to the advanced one, where you talk about exploratory and explanatory methods, it's more advanced. And it's a detailed workshop on its own. I was just giving you an outline to say where the mixed method is now. Where we are currently, especially at some of our levels, well, maybe my PhD will disagree with me, but at some of the levels we are now more on the triangulation mixed methods, where I can say I'm using both quantitative and qualitative. Then when I collect my data in quantitative, maybe I'm using a survey or a questionnaire. Then I analyze the data and interpret the data. If I want to do maybe descriptive analysis, I do that. If I want to take it to a further level and do inferential statistics, I also do that in quantitative in that way. Then my qualitative, definitely, it's where I want to see my perceptions and understanding. So I'll analyze it and also coming with, do the coding. I'll come with the themes, then I'll give the interpretation of the themes where I provide my responses in the form of verbatim, so that there could be a clear distinction between these two methods.
Oh, okay. So for this level, it's just those two methods.
Yes,
and we go more in detail with those two methods.
Yes, I prefer if you are doing your masters and also maybe your honors, can you just stick on that a little bit? Then if you go in advance, I know that there are PhD students here, and I still believe those PhD students who are attending today, they have not even working on the integrated mixed method even now. So we are still, but the reading I've provided in regards to the advanced level of the integrated mixed method, according to those guys, which I provided in one of the presentations on the slides there. I think it was slide, if can't even remember the slide here. Oh, yeah, this slide. If you can visit their work, Johnson and colleague, you'll be able to read further. But my intention is that if this goes well, I don't know when, I'll liaise with my colleagues so that maybe we can get someone who can present this integrated mixed method in detail, maybe for an hour. I'll see in my schedule and liaising with my colleagues, Mr. Hloni and also Membaile, so that you can get it better from a well-advanced person who's using those methods, or the integration one. Okay?
Yeah. Sure, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I want us to move quickly to this slide. Data collection. Data collection definitely has been described as a process of gathering and measuring information on targeted variables in an established system, which then enables to answer relevant questions or hypotheses and also evaluate the outcomes. While Technopedia defined data collection as a process of gathering and measuring data, information on any other variables of interest in a standardized and established manner. Okay, data collection is a process of collecting information from all the relevant sources to find answers to the research problems, test the hypothesis, and evaluate the outcomes. Basically, in your writing up, when you are writing your honors, your masters, you describe what this data collection is all about. You define it according to various authors. Then from there, you tell us how have you collected your data? What data collection instrument have you used? I think we spoke about this aspect. Some of them are more repetitive, so I'm not going to touch on this slide. I think it's a repetition of the previous ones. All right, how do you design your data collection instrument? Where do you start? Colleagues, I want to be open and frank with you. I'm not cloning myself, okay? But remember that what's important when you design a data collection instrument, you are not testing your participant. It's not a test. Please, it's not a test. Let's say, for example, I'm talking about a certain concept. Let's say staff development. All right, let me just use that one. If I want to find out about my participant understanding of the concept of staff development, and I'm doing an interview, there's no way I'll ask them to say, define staff development. No. In other words, I'm testing them now. But I can put it in a certain way to say, can you provide me with your understanding about the concept of staff development? In other words, I just want your understanding. I don't want you to go and define it, all right? But your understanding is going to assist me in my research. Then I'll be able to give a better analysis, and interpretation. Maybe I'll find, based on the verbatim responses of my participant, I can come to a conclusion, maybe to say they have different understanding of the concept of staff development. In other words, they understand it in the different ways. Then I can even cite the responses from different participants to say, participant A understand staff development as this and that, whereas participant B understand it as that and that. Then it means I can come to a conclusion to say there's no one-way understanding of this concept from my participant, so that when I go and do my recommendation, I can come with a better recommendation based on their responses. So what we need to bear in mind, we are not running a test when we design these instruments. Okay, that's why in quantitative, I always like to refer to those aspects as statements, not questions. The only time I'll use the phrase question is when I do qualitative. And in my interview schedule, then I'll call those aspects questions. And I always tease my students to say definitely a question. At the end, it needs to have a question mark. But in quantitative, I refer to them as statements. Okay. When you design any data collection instrument, it is important to take into consideration some of these aspects. I always say the research topic is the key, or your research title. Your research questionnaire, your research questions or hypotheses. And remember that your research question, which is made out of your main and your sub-questions, they formulate the objectives. So at the same time, in my case, what I normally do, I'm not saying that is the correct way, but I found it easier. If I use my research questions, based on them, it sometimes becomes easier to come with themes, especially when I'm doing qualitative studies. Then I'm able to come with themes easier. And maybe based on the feedback of my respondents, maybe I also have additional sub-themes. You find that you have a theme, then there are sub-themes. Interview questions or questions. Variables, statements can be developed from the literature. In other words, you may decide to say, okay, I formulate my questionnaire statements from the literature. You can formulate it from literature, okay? In other words, you may find that in your quantitative study, you have used a questionnaire and all the statements are coming from the literature. It's also allowed. Or you can formulate them based on your research questions or your hypothesis. So you have to decide as a student, okay? Bear in mind that these aspects are also key in a measurable instrument. I'm going to talk about this, the phase validity, content validity, reliability, okay? I think in one of my presentations, I'm going to touch on these aspects in detail so that you must understand if I'm talking about content validity, what do I mean? You can use different instruments to run your test, especially in quantitative. You can use SPSS. You can use, there's one I've learned about nowadays, is they call it Jamovi, if I'm not mistaken, and I think it's free also, but SPSS is not free, all right? You can also run tests to test for all of this, the Cronbach Alpha, KMO, and so on. But I'm going to talk about these concepts in the near presentations, not in this one. Briefly, let's look at the questionnaire. How do you develop it? Kuma suggests some of these factors, but before I come to these factors, I want to share with you that questionnaire or a survey it can be developed in two ways. One, we call it a dimension reduction technique. And the other one, we refer to it as a construct. Okay, those are the two ways which you normally use to develop a questionnaire or a survey. What does the dimension reduction technique means? It means if, let's say, for example, I have 20, let's say 50 statements, all right, in this questionnaire. There are 50 statements. What I'll do in my questionnaire, I'll write all the 50 statements together with the Likert scale. Let's say the Likert scale is agree, neutral, and disagree. To each statement, statement 1 is going to align to the Likert scale. Statement 2, 3, up to 50. Where a participant will choose, for example, statement 1, whether he agrees with that or disagrees with that or neutral. Then a person can put a tick or a cross up to the last statement, which is statement number 50. That's what you call more of a dimension reduction technique. In other words, the statements are not grouped or categorized. It's just 1 up to 50. Then the other method or technique, we call it construct validity. It's whereby the same 50 statements are grouped into what you call, sometimes people call it themes. I don't like to use the word themes because I use the word themes when I talk about qualitative. They are grouped up according to their factor or variable or construct. Let's say, for example, I've got 8 factors. Let's use the word factors. I've got 8 factors. The first one talks about discipline. The other one talks about understanding, staff development. The other one talks about that, and that one. So the first factor, what I'll do, I'll have that factor. Then under that factor, I'll look at the 50 statements there to say maybe statement 1, 4, 7, and 8. They talk about discipline. Then I put them under discipline. Then I'll end up having 4 statements there. Then I look at the same list of statements. Which one are talking to understanding staff development? Let's say there are 5. Then I'll put those factors there. In other words, now it's easy for me to have designed the questionnaire according to constructs, according to factors, according to variables, or according to themes. And in that way, in other words, I'm grouping aspects which belongs together according to a certain factor or a variable or a theme. That's what you call construct validity. And that helps you. I like the second technique of construct, because when you are designing this questionnaire of yours, there's no way, for example, under the construct of discipline, you won't see a statement which talks about understanding staff development there. Already, when you put the statement there, when you are reading it, you are able to see, to say, this statement does not belong there. It belongs to this variable of understanding staff development. So how does it help you? It helps you when you do your test, so that at the end, you find that statements are not overlapping in other variables. Okay, because if, for example, let's make this, if, for example, under the, let's use the word factor, discipline. If I have one statement there which talks about understanding staff development, you know what's going to happen? When I run my test through SPSS, it's going to give me results. But the results which I'm going to get from SPSS is going to show that under the variable of understanding staff development, there's one factor which is missing there. If there were 5 statements, you may find that now it gives me 4 statements. Because the other statement, sorry, it has overloaded into a factor which you call discipline. Then I'll be able to see it under discipline because it does not belong there. Automatically, the system is going to put it in the correct place. So in other words, when you analyze, you need to analyze it differently. Okay. I want us to look at, I think here, basically when you look at Kuma, always says, when you develop your questionnaire, you must use simple and everyday language. Avoid ambiguous questions or statements. We've spoken about that one. Avoid asking questions which are based on presumptions. Avoid asking leading questions. Avoid double parallel questions. Note that a questionnaire is not a test. I've spoken about that one also. So simple English, simple statements are needed. When I design my survey, most of the time, I always have 2 sections or parts. The first one, definitely, sometimes I refer to it as part A, sometimes section A. I want to get the biographical information of my participant. Please, colleagues, in your questionnaire or your survey, when you ask for the biographical information, you must ask them because you are going to use that information. Don't ask your participant about gender if you are not going to use that information. Don't ask them about their age if you are not going to use it. The same thing about their grades, about their years, and all of those things. All right? And I always say to my students, in regards to the gender, make sure that you are sensitive to gender. Sorry for that. Okay? We are used to asking 2 options there. 1, male or female. Please include maybe other students, what they do, they always give the 3rd option to say other, and they ask you to specify. But I don't like also to use that one also. Okay? I always like to say, those who don't like to specify, I give them that option as option number 3. Okay? So that we become more sensitive. And yeah, I just want to live in that in that way. All right? I don't want to go into details. Then the next part, which always might be, sometimes can have C. But in my B, what I normally do, I always make sure that I want to get my participant understanding of the topic I'm dealing with. Sorry. If I'm dealing with staff development, all my statements, they have to align to staff development. But if, for example, in my literature, I got another chapter on my literature where I talk about managing change, definitely I can have maybe an option C, where all the statements I'll be asking and their variables, they talk to managing change or understanding change. So it also depends. In other words, you can also use my literature in that aspect. Use a Likert scale. Decide which one we are using. You can use 2 Likert scale, yes or no, agree or disagree. 3, 4, 5, it depends. Okay? And also in your questionnaire, indicate maybe by an example, especially how are they supposed to respond to this Likert scale. I always do that. In my questionnaire, I give them an example. If I want tick, If I want to cross, I give them an example of a statement, then from there I put the Likert scale. So they must be able to know on how to respond to my questionnaire. You can have also open question. It could be 2 or 3, but most of the time we put it at the end. An example, I want us to look at this example. I'm going to use this example even next week, okay? But I want just to talk about part B, which I think it's an example which it has to do with section B here, but I've just referred to it as part B here, all right? Now, this is an example of how do I design my questionnaire using the second technique, which I call it construct validity. In other words, I group my statement according to a variable or a factor or a constant. For example, in this case, I can say the name of this factor, I can call it motivation. I can call it motivation. So what I did, I have all these codes, motivation 1, 2, 3, 4. We always do this so that when you subject it to an analysis tool, it's easy to come with better analysis of data, all right? Then I've put a Likert scale there. In my case, I think I've put 5 Likert scale there, all right? There are 5 dimensions in that Likert scale. It's never, really, sometimes, often, and always, okay? So after I have all this Likert scale, what I normally do, I always group the first 2 together. Then I can, when I do my analysis, all right? I've collected data now. Now I do my analysis. What I normally do, I group the first 2. Then I can call it never. Then I group the last 4, the last 2, which is 4 and 5. Then I can refer to it as always. Then I leave the first, then the middle one. In other words, in my analysis, I have 3 options, which is never, sometimes, and always. Then when you look at the statement now, when my participants are supposed to respond, they must choose one option as per Likert scale. Once you choose this for this M1 and this one and this one, the results are going to be spoiled results. So you must choose one. But remember that the program, like the SPSS, is going to give you the outcome. Okay? Especially if you are not analyzing manually. But when you look at all of, let's look at the statements. The first one says, I have a clear understanding of how I can use my qualification after graduating. Let's assume that the variable there is motivation, all right? The next one says, I motivate myself and take personal responsibility for my learning. The other one says, when I encounter material that I do not find interesting and enjoyable, I get bored with it. I use different strategies to engage with my learning material. So when you look at all of this, when you talk about content validity, we are saying, are all these statements, 4 of them, are they related to motivation? Are they talking to the variable? What I'm saying, when you talk about content validity, we want to check to say all these 4 statements, are they talking or are they related to the concept or theme of or factor of variable of motivation? Are they talking to motivation? So if one of these 4, they are not talking to motivation, when you do your analysis via a program like SPSS, it's going to tell you to say, no, when you look at this statement, there's this statement which does not talk to motivation. It talks to something else. Well, let's take a second briefly. Look at these 4 statements. Can you indicate which one, if there's anyone, which one does not relate to motivation? Okay, I can see someone says M1. Oh, number 2, M1, M1, M4, M1 and 4, M1, 2 and M2 and M4, M3, and so on and so on. Okay, interesting. But when you look at, thanks for your response, colleagues. So when you look at these statements, definitely the last one, it has nothing to do with motivation. All of them, the other M1, motivation 1, motivation 2, and 3, they are talking to the construct or the factor of motivation. They are aligning to motivation, definitely. So think about this, the first one. If a student agree to say they do have a clear understanding of how their qualification, they'll use their qualification after graduating, it leads to motivation. The second one is obvious. M3, when I encounter material that I do not find interesting and enjoyable, I get bored with it. It has to do with motivation. All right? The last one, it has nothing to do with motivation. But I can align it to a construct of reading, where it says I use different strategies to engage with my learning material. It has to do with reading. So if I have, let's say, for example, I have another construct there. I have motivation, then I have reading. When you analyze it via SPSS, it's going to show you the results to say the fourth one, M4, it has been loaded to reading. So in your results via the SPSS, you won't find this one in the analysis, M4. M4, you see it under reading variable. But how does it going to be coded? It's going to be coded as M4. Then the others are going to be R1, R2, R3, or R4, which talks about reading 1, reading 2, 3, and 4, and all their statements. Then at the bottom, you get the M4. So it means, basically, this statement, it does not belong under the construct of motivation. So it's wrongly placed. So that's why we say piloting and analyzing your data after piloting could assist you to develop a better data collection instrument. Okay, qualitative one, well, definitely we call it a qualitative, we call it an interview schedule. Others, they refer to it as a protocol. Then you just have to put the questions there. Just a disclaimer about these questions, definitely. I should have changed it, but I've left it the way they are. There's a publication which is coming sooner, I think before the end of May, where I've done a research and I've put some of these questions in that type of a book chapter. Basically, the research is about understanding the name giving according to a certain grouping in South Africa. So, yeah, basically, those are the questions I've posed, but I've rephrased them in a different way in that book. But when you look at those questions, there are very few. I can have 3 questions. I can have 5 questions. And I can cover 5 questions for my PhD if I want, okay? Because it's not about quantifying your data collection instrument, because it's what we call a point of saturation as we are interviewing a participant. So if I have this, and we are going to use it next week, okay, on how to analyze quantitative. We'll use the example of the construct which I've shared here, all right? And also we use this one to analyze our qualitative data. So I'm not going to go through all of these questions. Well, I think Chomal suggests the following steps in conducting interviews, while other authors, they will suggest their steps, all right? The first one, you prepare questions, definitely. You plan the logistic. Are you going to do it online? Are you going to do it face-to-face? Going to be group and the time and so on and all of those things. If it's online, maybe how are you going to make sure that your participants, they have data so they can join on Teams and all of those things. You plan all those logistics. And when you're conducting the interview, you start with an opening, maybe you introduce yourself, give them the reason why you are conducting these interviews. You also assure the issue of anonymity and so on and so on and so on. All those things you need to talk about them. Then from there, you start to conduct the interview. Then I think you establish the report by then. When you do your state opening, then you record the responses. Please, colleagues, even though you do it online, you need to get a permission or a consent from your participant to record the sessions. All right, those interview sessions. So, but they must get a reason why. All right, if you want them also to consent to that, what they normally do nowadays, they embed the consent on the instrument itself. All right. Then from there, after you've done everything, then you also have to thank the interviewees. But remember that even though you record the session and you get the permission to record the session, it's online, whether it's face-to-face, you have a tape recorder and so on, make sure that you have your notebook again, where you make some notes. Because you know, sometimes when you're going to do the transcription, you may find that some of the things are not even clear on the recordings. But if you have your notebook with you, you are able to refer to the notebook. In a case, anything happened to your recordings, what backup do you have? Because if you have your notebook, you can do your transcription, your coding, and film presentation based on the notes. So we need also to think about a backup. And don't say that maybe I'm recording it on my laptop. Anything can happen with your laptop. It can crash. So you lose the information. Well, people, they say nowadays information is there on the cloud, is it? I like technology. Né? What happens if something happened to the cloud? I don't know which cloud I'm referring to. But what I'm always saying, guys, please, the notebook for me, it's more handy. Okay. I think we've done one exercise where we wanted to find out the aspect of content validity. I want us to have this as a take-home exercise. I've seen that in the past, most of the time, I don't have time to do this exercise. So let's make it a take-home. When we meet next week, you need to come with at least a developed questionnaire. Only the part B of it. You can have one construct, all right? Maybe with 3 or 4 statements. Or you can decide to do a qualitative interview schedule and provide maybe 3 or 4 interview questions based on your study, so that we can try also to see if we are able to follow the whole session. If we decide to, especially in a quantitative, to have maybe dimension reduction technique, it's also fine, but I would prefer the construct validity technique. And I'm always opt for that, colleagues, because I know that sometimes when we develop a survey and we apply the dimension reduction techniques, you end up having 50 statements there in that question. You may find that some of them are not even talking to your research question, your hypothesis, let alone your research title. But if you put them in a construct validity way as a technique, you are able to check on your own, like we have done with this exercise. Okay. We can recap on what we have done, but let's put it for next week. We start by recapping about the content of today. But what's important is that next week, definitely, we'll meet at the same time. But now we are going to look on the analysis of data now. We'll look specifically to quantitative. How do you analyze your quantitative data? So we are going to look at all of those terminology, like test, like reliability, you name it. So all those, the KMO, the Chromebook Alpha, and all of those concepts, we'll be looking at them next week so that we have a better understanding about some of those concepts. Thanks for coming.